Margaret Davis was folding laundry in her small apartment when the mail carrier knocked on her door that Tuesday morning. She wasn't expecting anything important, just the usual bills and grocery store flyers. But there it was, a thick, cream-colored envelope with her name written in fancy script across the front. The return address made her heart skip a beat. It was from the law office of Harrison and Associates, the same firm that had handled Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's legal affairs for decades. Margaret held the envelope in her hands for a long moment before opening it. Mrs. Whitmore had passed away just 2 weeks ago, and Margaret was still processing the loss. For 12 long years, she had been more than just a caregiver to the elderly woman. She had become her companion, her friend, and in many ways, the daughter Eleanor never had. Every morning, Margaret would arrive at the Grand Victorian House on Magnolia Street, greeting Eleanor with a warm smile and a cup of her favorite Earl Grey tea. The house itself was something out of a fairy tale. Built in 1892, it stood 3 stories tall with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and towering oak trees that provided shade in the hot Charleston summers. Margaret had spent countless hours in that house, dusting the antique furniture, organizing Eleanor's extensive book collection, and listening to stories about the old days when Charleston society families gathered for elaborate dinner parties and garden soirees. Eleanor Whitmore had been born into one of Charleston's oldest families, the kind that traced their lineage back to before the Civil War. The walls of her home were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and Eleanor could tell you the story behind every piece of silver, every painting, every piece of furniture that had been passed down through generations. But despite her privileged background, Eleanor had always treated Margaret with respect and kindness that was rare in her social circle. When Margaret first started working for Eleanor, she had expected the job to be like all the others, keeping a polite distance, doing her duties, and going home at the end of the day. But Eleanor had other ideas. She insisted that Margaret join her for lunch, asked about her family, and genuinely cared about her well-being. When Margaret's own mother fell ill, Eleanor had quietly arranged for the best doctors and even helped with the medical bills, never making a big deal about it. Now, staring at the legal letter, Margaret carefully tore open the envelope. The formal language was hard to understand at first, full of legal terms that made her head spin. But the main message was clear. She was being invited to attend the reading of Eleanor Whitmore's last will and testament. The date was set for the following Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Margaret read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of why she would be included in such a formal proceeding. She had heard Eleanor mention her family members over the years, though most of them rarely visited. There was her nephew Richard, who worked in finance and only showed up when he needed Eleanor to sign financial papers. His sister Patricia lived in Atlanta and would call once a month, usually when she needed money for her children's private school tuition or her husband's latest business venture. Then there were Eleanor's grandchildren, spoiled young adults, who saw their great-aunt as nothing more than a walking bank account. They would arrive for Christmas and Easter, staying just long enough to receive their generous checks before rushing off to more exciting social obligations. Margaret had watched Eleanor's face during these visits, seeing the disappointment she tried to hide when her own family treated her like an obligation rather than a person. The more Margaret thought about it, the more confused she became about her invitation to the will reading. Maybe Eleanor had left her something small as a token of appreciation. Perhaps her favorite teacup, the delicate china one with hand-painted roses that Eleanor had brought back from a trip to England in her younger days. Or maybe a few $100, enough to help with rent for a month or 2 while Margaret looked for her next job. The thought of finding new work made Margaret's stomach turn. At 52 years old, she wasn't getting any younger, and good caregiving positions were hard to find. She had been lucky with Eleanor. The pay was fair, the work was meaningful, and most importantly, she had felt valued and appreciated. Not every elderly person was as kind and respectful as Eleanor had been. Margaret walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the small garden she had planted behind her apartment building. Eleanor had taught her about flowers during their time together, sharing her extensive knowledge of roses, magnolias, and jasmine. Even in her final months, when Eleanor's arthritis made it hard for her to move around, she would sit by the window and direct Margaret on how to care for the plants. In her elaborate garden, the week leading up to the will reading passed slowly. Margaret found herself cleaning her small apartment obsessively, a nervous habit she had developed over the years. She pressed her best dress, a simple navy blue one she had bought for church services, and polished her only pair of dress shoes. She wasn't sure what to expect at a formal will reading, but she wanted to look respectable and honor Eleanor's memory. On Thursday night, Margaret barely slept. She kept thinking about Eleanor's final days, how peaceful she had looked in her hospital bed, surrounded by the few family members who had bothered to show up. Eleanor had squeezed Margaret's hand and whispered, "Thank you for everything, dear. You've been such a blessing in my life." Those words had meant more to Margaret than any paycheck ever could. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Charleston weather that matched Margaret's mood. She took extra care getting dressed, checking herself in the mirror multiple times. The law office was downtown, in one of those old buildings that had been converted from a historic mansion into professional offices. Margaret had never been inside before, though she had driven past it many times while running errands for Eleanor. As she walked up the steps to the building, Margaret felt increasingly nervous. She didn't belong in places like this, with their marble floors and crystal chandeliers. This was the world of Eleanor's family, wealthy, educated people who spoke in legal terms and made decisions about millions of dollars. Margaret was just a caregiver from a modest background, someone who had worked hard her entire life but had never accumulated much wealth or status. The receptionist directed her to the second floor where the conference room was located. Margaret climbed the wooden staircase slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. She could hear voices coming from behind a heavy oak door, familiar voices that belonged to Eleanor's family members. They were already there, probably discussing their expectations for the inheritance and making plans for how to spend their portions of Eleanor's considerable wealth. Margaret paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before knocking. Whatever Eleanor had left her, she would be grateful for it. Even if it was just a small keepsake, it would be a reminder of the 12 wonderful years they had shared together. She had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Margaret knocked softly on the heavy oak door and heard someone call out, "Come in," from inside. She pushed the door open and stepped into the most impressive room she had ever seen. The conference room was straight out of a movie, with dark wooden walls that reached up to a high ceiling, thick burgundy curtains covering tall windows, and a massive table that could seat at least 20 people. The smell of leather and old books filled the air, and Margaret felt like she had stepped back in time. But what struck her most wasn't the fancy furniture or the expensive artwork on the walls. It was the silence that fell over the room the moment she walked in. 6 pairs of eyes turned to look at her, and Margaret immediately felt like she didn't belong there. The family members were already seated around the polished table, dressed in their finest clothes and speaking in hushed tones about things she couldn't quite hear. Richard Whitmore sat at one end of the table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, and his graying hair slicked back with what looked like too much gel. He was Eleanor's nephew, the one who handled her financial affairs and always seemed to be in a hurry whenever he visited. Margaret had served him coffee dozens of times over the years, but he had never once asked her name or said thank you. Now he looked at her with the same blank expression he might give a piece of furniture. Next to Richard sat his sister Patricia, who had driven down from Atlanta for the occasion. She was wearing a black dress that probably cost more than Margaret, made in a month, and her jewelry sparkled under the room's chandelier. Patricia had always been polite to Margaret, but in the way people are polite to waiters at restaurants, distant and careful not to get too personal. Today she offered Margaret a tight smile before turning back to whisper something to her brother. The younger generation was there too. Eleanor's great-nephew Kevin sat across from his father Richard, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of someone who had better places to be. He was in his 30s but acted like a teenager, always asking Eleanor for money to fund his latest business idea or pay off his credit card debt. His wife Jessica sat beside him, checking her reflection in a small mirror and reapplying her lipstick. She had only met Eleanor a handful of times, but had always made sure to compliment the old woman's jewelry. and ask where she had gotten various pieces. Patricia's daughter Ashley was there too, having flown in from New York where she worked at some fashion magazine. She was the type of person who spoke loudly about her important job and her expensive apartment, but Margaret had noticed that she always left Eleanor's house with her purse a little heavier than when she arrived. Ashley barely glanced at Margaret before returning to a whispered conversation with her cousin Kevin about property values in Charleston's historic district. The only person Margaret didn't recognize was a well-dressed woman in her 40s who sat near the head of the table. Later, she would learn this was Eleanor's financial advisor, someone who had been managing the family's investments for the past decade. Even she looked at Margaret with curiosity, as if trying to figure out why. The help was sitting at the same table as the family. Margaret took a seat at the far end of the table, as far from the family cluster as possible. She could feel their eyes on her, and hear their whispered conversations that stopped whenever she looked in their direction. The chair felt too big, the table too fancy, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding on something private and important. Mr. Harrison, the lawyer, was a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes who had been handling Eleanor's legal affairs for over 20 years. He was the only person in the room who treated Margaret with the same respect he showed the family members. When she entered, he had stood up and offered her a seat, asking if she would like some water or coffee. His secretary, a middle-aged woman named Betty, had even smiled at Margaret and made small talk about the weather. While they waited for the proceedings to begin, Margaret listened to the family conversations swirling around her. Richard was talking about real estate markets and investment portfolios, using words that sounded important but meant nothing to Margaret. Patricia was discussing her children's college plans and how expensive private universities had become. The younger family members were sharing gossip about people Margaret had never heard of, mentioning vacation homes and country club memberships like they were everyday things. What bothered Margaret most wasn't that they were wealthy. She had known that for years. It was how they talked about Eleanor's money as if it already belonged to them. Kevin mentioned needing funds for a new business venture, while Jessica talked about renovating their kitchen. Ashley discussed her student loans and how much easier life would be once she could pay them off. They spoke about Eleanor's death not as a loss of a beloved family member, but as the opening of a financial opportunity. Margaret thought about all the times Eleanor had been lonely in that big house, waiting for phone calls that rarely came and visits that happened only when someone needed something. She remembered how Eleanor's face would light up on the rare occasions when family members did visit, how she would spend days preparing special meals and buying expensive gifts, only to have them rush through dinner and leave as quickly as possible. The contrast was heartbreaking. Here were people who shared Eleanor's blood, her family name, and her history, yet they had treated her like a bank account rather than a person. Meanwhile, Margaret, who had no claim to the family legacy or fortune, had spent 12 years genuinely caring for Eleanor, listening to her stories, holding her hand during difficult nights, and treating her with the dignity and respect she deserved. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret felt more and more uncomfortable. She started to wonder if coming to the will reading had been a mistake. Maybe she should have stayed home and let the family handle their business in private. What did she really expect to receive anyway? Eleanor had already been generous during her lifetime, helping with medical bills and always paying Margaret fairly for her work. The family members continued their conversations, occasionally glancing in Margaret's direction with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild annoyance. She could almost hear their thoughts. Why is the caregiver here? What could Eleanor possibly have left to someone who wasn't family? Their whispered conversations and sideways glances made Margaret feel smaller and more out of place with each passing minute. Mr. Harrison finally cleared his throat and announced that it was time to begin. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to the lawyer, who opened a thick folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she folded them in her lap, trying to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. She had no idea that the next hour would turn her world upside down and change everything she thought she knew about herself, her past, and her future. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked around the room at each person seated at the polished table. Margaret could feel her heart beating faster as the lawyer opened the thick folder containing Eleanor's final wishes. The room was so quiet that she could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, counting down the seconds until everything would be revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Harrison began in his calm, professional voice, "we are here today to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, dated March 15th of this year. Mrs. Whitmore was of sound mind and body when this document was prepared, and it reflects her final wishes regarding the distribution of her estate." Margaret noticed how everyone seemed to lean forward slightly, their earlier casual conversations now forgotten. Richard had put away his phone, Patricia had stopped fidgeting with her jewelry, and even the younger family members looked more focused than she had ever seen them. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation and barely contained excitement. The lawyer began with the standard legal language that Margaret didn't understand, reading through paragraphs about taxes and legal procedures that made her eyes glaze over. But then he got to the actual bequests and suddenly everyone was hanging on his every word. "To the Charleston Historical Society," Mr. Harrison read, "I leave my collection of antique books and historical documents, valued at approximately $50,000. Patricia nodded approvingly, as if this was exactly what she had expected. The family had always known that Eleanor cared deeply about preserving Charleston's history. "To St. Michael's Church, where I have worshipped for over 60 years, I leave the sum of $100,000 for the maintenance and restoration of the building." This announcement brought smiles to several faces around the table. It was a generous gift, but not surprising given Eleanor's lifelong devotion to her faith. Mr. Harrison continued reading through smaller bequests. $10,000 to her longtime housekeeper who had retired 5 years earlier, $5,000 to the gardener who had maintained her property for decades, and various amounts to charities she had supported throughout her life. Margaret felt a flutter of hope when she heard about the gifts to other employees. Maybe Eleanor really had remembered her with a small token of appreciation. Then came the personal items. "To my great-niece Ashley, I leave my grandmother's pearl, necklace and matching earrings." Ashley's face lit up with genuine pleasure. She had admired those pearls for years. "To my great-nephew Kevin, I leave my father's gold pocket watch and chain." Kevin looked surprised but pleased, probably already calculating what the antique timepiece might be worth. The lawyer worked his way through jewelry, artwork, and family heirlooms, distributing Eleanor's treasured possessions among relatives, who had varying degrees of connection to the items. Margaret listened politely, feeling more and more like an outsider as the family members received their inheritances. She began to wonder if Eleanor had simply forgotten to include her in the will, or if her invitation to the reading had been some kind of mistake. But then Mr. Harrison's tone changed slightly. He looked up from the document and glanced around the room before continuing. "Now we come to the matter of Mrs. Whitmore's real estate holdings and remaining financial assets." The energy in the room shifted dramatically. This was what everyone had really come to hear about. Eleanor's house alone was worth over $2 million, and her investment portfolio was rumored to be worth several million more. Margaret could practically feel the tension radiating from the family members as they waited to learn how Eleanor's substantial wealth would be divided among them. Mrs. Whitmore owned 3 properties. The lawyer continued. "The beach cottage in Folly Beach, valued at approximately $400,000, I leave to my nephew Richard, to be shared equally with his sister Patricia." Both siblings smiled with satisfaction. The beach house had been in the family for generations, and they had spent many childhood summers there. The downtown apartment building on King Street, which generates rental income of approximately $60,000 per year, I leave to be divided equally among my great-nieces and great-nephews. The younger generation exchanged excited glances. Owning rental property in downtown Charleston was like having a guaranteed income for life. Margaret watched these announcements with a mixture of happiness for the family and growing resignation about her own situation. Eleanor had been generous to everyone, just as she had been generous throughout her life. Margaret told herself that she should be grateful just to have been included in this final goodbye to the woman who had meant so much to her. But then Mr. Harrison paused for a long moment, looking down at the document in his hands. When he looked up again, his expression was more serious than it had been all afternoon. This brings us to Mrs. Whitmore's primary residence, the family home at 847 Magnolia Street. The room fell completely silent. This was the big moment, the announcement everyone had been waiting for. The Victorian mansion wasn't just valuable property, it was the heart of the Whitmore family legacy, filled with generations of memories and priceless antiques. It was the crown jewel of Eleanor's estate, and whoever inherited it would essentially become the keeper of the family's history and tradition. Margaret assumed it would go to Richard, as the oldest male relative, or perhaps be divided somehow among all the family members. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, feeling more than ever like she was witnessing something private that she had no business seeing. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began to read Eleanor's exact words from the will. His voice carried clearly across the silent room as he spoke the words that would change everything. The house at 847 Magnolia Street, along with all its contents, furnishings, and personal property contained therein, I leave in its entirety to Margaret Davis. For a moment, Margaret wasn't sure she had heard correctly. The words seemed to echo in her head, but they didn't make sense. She looked around the table, expecting to see confusion on the other faces, expecting someone to ask the lawyer to repeat what he had just said. But instead, she saw shock, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to anger. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Could you repeat that?" Mr. Harrison looked directly at Margaret as he read the next part of Eleanor's will. To Margaret Davis, who has cared for me with kindness and devotion for 12 years, who treated me not as an employer but as family, who brought joy and companionship to my final years when my own relatives could not find time to visit. To Margaret, I leave my beloved home, knowing that she will preserve its history and honor its legacy as I have tried to do. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just heard. The house, Eleanor's magnificent house, worth millions of dollars, was hers? It seemed impossible, like some kind of mistake or cruel joke. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small envelope with Margaret's name written on it in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, along with a set of brass keys that Margaret recognized immediately. They were the keys to 847 Magnolia Street, keys to her new home. The silence in the room lasted only a few seconds, but to Margaret it felt like hours. She sat frozen in her chair, the brass keys heavy in her hands, trying to process what had just happened. The elegant conference room that had felt intimidating before now felt like a powder keg about to explode. She could see the shock and disbelief on every face around the table, and she knew that what came next wasn't going to be pleasant. Richard was the first to break the silence. He stood up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. His face had gone from pale to bright red in a matter of seconds, and Margaret could see a vein pulsing at his temple. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice getting louder with each word. "There has to be some mistake. My aunt would never do something like this. She wouldn't leave the family home to—" He paused, looking directly at Margaret with an expression of pure disgust. "To someone who isn't even family." Mr. Harrison remained calm, his hands folded on the table as he watched Richard's outburst. "I understand this is unexpected, Mr. Whitmore, but I can assure you that there is no mistake. Your aunt was very clear about her intentions when she updated her will 6 months ago." 6 months ago? Patricia's voice was shrill as she joined her brother in standing. "She changed her will 6 months ago? How is that possible? Richard, you were handling all of her financial affairs. How did you not know about this?" Richard's face grew even redder. "I handled her investments and bills, not her personal legal matters. But this doesn't make sense. Aunt Eleanor was always talking about keeping the family legacy intact, about preserving our history. She wouldn't just give away the family home to a stranger." Margaret felt like she was watching a nightmare unfold around her. These people were talking about her as if she wasn't sitting right there, as if she was some kind of criminal who had stolen something that belonged to them. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt tight, and her hands were shaking as she clutched the keys that Mr. Harrison had given her. Kevin jumped up from his seat, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret. She manipulated her. Can't you see what happened here? She took advantage of lonely old woman. She probably convinced Aunt Eleanor that we didn't care about her, that we were only interested in her money. That's exactly what happened, Jessica chimed in, her voice full of righteous anger. I've seen this before. These caregivers, they get close to elderly people, and then they manipulate them into changing their wills. It's elder abuse, plain and simple. Ashley was pacing back and forth behind her chair, her high heels clicking angrily on the wooden floor. This is insane. That house has been in our family for over a century. Our great-great-grandfather built it. Our ancestors lived there, died there. It's full of family heirlooms and memories that belong to us, not to some random person who worked there. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never asked Eleanor for anything beyond fair payment for her work. She had never even dreamed that Eleanor would leave her something in her will, let alone something as valuable as the house. The accusations flying around the room made her feel sick to her stomach. You're all jumping to conclusions, Mr. Harrison said firmly, his professional demeanor starting to show cracks of irritation. Mrs. Whitmore was evaluated by 2 independent physicians and a psychologist before making these changes to her will. She was found to be completely competent and of sound mind. She made this decision freely, without any coercion or undue influence. Doctors can be bought. Richard shot back. How much did she pay them to say she was competent? This whole thing stinks of manipulation and fraud. Patricia was now crying, mascara running down her cheeks as she gestured wildly with her hands. That house means everything to our family. It's where I spent summers as a child, where I learned about our history, where I plan to bring my own grandchildren someday. You can't just give it away to someone who has no connection to our family, no understanding of what it means. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I never asked for this. I had no idea Mrs. Whitmore was planning to do anything like this. Oh, please, Kevin said with a harsh laugh. Don't act all innocent. You knew exactly what you were doing. You probably spent years working on her, convincing her that we didn't care about her, that you were the only one who understood her. That's not true, Margaret said, her voice getting stronger despite her fear. I cared about Mrs. Whitmore because she was a good person. She was kind to me when she didn't have to be. I never asked her for anything. Right, Ashley said sarcastically. And I suppose it's just a coincidence that a $2 million house ended up in your hands. You must think we're all idiots. The financial advisor, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, finally spoke up. If I may, she said in a calm voice that cut through the chaos. I had several conversations with Mrs. Whitmore about her estate planning over the past year. She was very deliberate about her decisions. She expressed frustration that her family members only visited when they needed money, and she was grateful for Margaret's companionship and care. You're all in on this together, Richard accused, his voice now hoarse from yelling. This is a conspiracy to steal from our family. Well, I won't stand for it. I'm going to contest this will in court. I'll fight this until every penny comes back where it belongs. Same here, Patricia added, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. That house belongs to the Whitmore family, and I'll make sure it stays in the Whitmore family. Mr. Harrison sighed deeply, clearly exhausted by the family's reaction. You have every right to contest the will if you choose to do so. However, I should warn you that Mrs. Whitmore anticipated this possibility. She left very detailed documentation of her reasoning, including video recordings of her explaining her decisions. She also had multiple witnesses to her mental competency, including her personal physician, her minister, and several close friends. The room erupted again as family members talked over each other, making accusations and threats. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the anger and hostility directed at her, She had never wanted to be in the middle of a family dispute, and she certainly had never wanted to be the cause of so much pain and anger. Through all the shouting and accusations, Margaret kept thinking about Eleanor's final days in the hospital. The old woman had seemed so peaceful, so ready to let go of earthly concerns. She had squeezed Margaret's hand and thanked her for being such a good friend. Now Margaret wondered if Eleanor had known what kind of chaos her final gift would create. Had she expected her family to react this way? Had she wanted to send them a message about how they had treated her over the years? As the angry voices swirled around her, Margaret clutched the brass keys tighter and tried to imagine what Eleanor would want her to do now.